We almost didn't report this story last night because it seemed too absurd. It had to be a hoax. One of those things you read on the internet and tell your brother-in-law and then find yourself embarrassed when you find out it's fake. Even in the middle of the cultural revolution now in progress in this country, the left hasn't become this hysterical and reactionary and stupid, we figured. Oh, but we were wrong. Turns out ESPN actually did pull football announcer Robert Lee from its upcoming broadcast of the UVA home opener. The reason? Lee, who is Asian, shares a first and last name with a long-dead Confederate general. Not making that up. In a statement today, ESPN claimed the decision had nothing to do with political correctness or with race, though, of course, the opposite is true in both cases. Liberals defended the decision anyway. Quote, "Not even the glorious game of football can keep America's toxic culture of bigotry, hate, and violence at bay," explained someone called Roxanne Jones on CNN's website. Whatever that means, you figure it out. News outlets did not help either, with coverage that was both misleading and dumb. Reuters, the wire service, for example, referred to Robert Lee as, quote, "the namesake of the general," though it's pretty unlikely one was named after the other. They later corrected it to say Lee is the general's, quote, "doppelganger," even dumber since they don't look alike. Meanwhile, America got a little less free in the process. Clay Travis is a journalist at Fox Sports, and he first broke this story of Lee being switched out on our show last night, actually. He now calls the network MSESPN. Britt McHenry, meanwhile, worked at ESPN until earlier this year and says she was fired for having conservative views. Both of them join us tonight. So, Clay, first to you. You broke this story. ESPN reacted in some greater detail today and said this had nothing to do with political correctness and nothing to do with race. Am I missing something, or is that just like a lie?
It's a lie. I mean, ESPN lies a lot. And Tucker, you know this, having covered politics for a long time. When you put out an initial statement, and then you have to follow it with another statement, and then you have to follow it with a third statement, what you're realizing is that everybody is calling you on your BS, and you're continuing to follow it with more BS. And so by the time you get to the third statement, the first statement is probably the most reliable. It didn't tell the full story, but this is what ESPN does. This is why fans on both the left and right sides of the political spectrum have been abandoning the network, because they aren't trustworthy. And because, like I said, they are MSESPN. They're using their ability to reach people through sports as an opportunity to become a left-leaning sports network. And it used to be sports was dessert. It was the toy chest of life. It was where we all went to escape the serious things that confronted us every day. And now that's not the case anymore. It's like, I've got 3 kids, Tucker. If I tell them you got dessert when you finish this meal, and then I give them broccoli, they're not going to be very happy. ESPN's giving us broccoli every single day and trying to sell it as dessert.
Well, that's right. That's the frustrating thing. That's why I'm almost never offended by MSNBC, the real one, because they are what they say they are, and that's fine. They're the Leon Trotsky Network. They act like it. I don't care. They're not lying to me anyway. So, Britt, you worked there. Are you surprised by this?
I probably had the same reaction that you did and that most of America did. I can tell you as a former employee that ESPN does do its due diligence in trying to protect the physical safety of its employees. In fact, 2.5 years ago, I had a video that went viral, and a week later, I was supposed to cover a playoff hockey game. And they took every measure to try to protect my physical safety because, let's face it, if you're in an arena or a stadium with 40,000 plus people, there's not much separation. So I would like to believe, because that could be the only logical consideration, that maybe that was discussed behind the scenes. But I think it's more a reflection of society right now and how left-wing and PC it's gotten, that even your name given at birth or the possibility of a meme on the internet is a reason to make a personnel change. I mean, if that's what we're doing here, Tucker, everyone might be out of a job, especially in this industry.
Well, sure. But the idea they're protecting him from whom? I mean, presumably the people they're protecting him from, like Robert E. Lee's. I don't really understand. I mean, it doesn't really, their explanation doesn't make much sense. So, Clay, there's an employee, and I don't mean to single anyone out. I'm not against this man, but there's a guy there called Bob Lee, who actually tweeted last night, apparently, that this whole story he thought was bizarre. But he shares a name with an infamous German army officer who was indicted at Nuremberg. And so a reporter over the Daily Caller called ESPN and just sort of as a joke and said, you know, one of your employees has the same name of this infamous historical figure. Are you going to let him on the air? They refused to answer the question. twice, rather than just say, of course, he's our employee. I'm sorry, he's got a name that is unfortunate. We're putting, no, they refuse to answer.
Yeah, well, look, this is the situation that they've created, right? And here's the big problem. You just hit on it, Tucker. What's the worst case scenario here? 100,000 people watch a crappy game between Virginia and William and Mary when there are like 50 games that are every bit as good or better going on that day, and a few people create memes saying like, oh, look, Robert E. Lee's trying to sneak back into Charlottesville, and nobody at ESPN, I think this goes to Britt's point, nobody at ESPN stands up and says, you know what? In the grand scheme of things, if we just let him call the game, this is a 45-minute or 1-hour story on social media that nobody remembers by the time Alabama and Florida State game is over on that Saturday night. Instead, they've created a multi-day mushroom cloud surrounding the company and made me look like a genius for calling them MSESPN and tying this all into whether it's Michael Sam being gay and he's a hero, or Colin Kaepernick taking a knee and he's a modern-day Rosa Parks, or whether, God forbid, Caitlyn Jenner decides that she wants to be a girl and gets the heroic award from ESPN for the entire year. Fans are reasonable, and they connect all these things, and they say, boy, it's hard to argue right now that ESPN is calling straight balls and strikes, as John Roberts, the Supreme Court Justice, said. They've got an agenda at play, and their agenda is very left-wing.
Yeah, it's overweening. So here's a statement. This just came in. This is from the president of ESPN, John Skipper. This is sent internally to ESPN employees. We're quoting now. Given the amount of media attention being generated by one of the countless routine decisions our local production teams make every day. Oh, God. What an opening. I wanted to make sure you have the facts. There was never any concern by anyone at any level that Robert Lee's name would offend anyone watching the Charlottesville game. Among our production staff in Charlottesville, there was a question as to whether, in these divisive times, Robert's assignment might create a distraction or, even worse, expose him to social hectoring and trolling. Since Robert was their primary concern, he said disingenuously, they consulted with him directly. He expressed some personal trepidation about the assignment, and when offered to do the Youngstown State-Pitt game instead, opted for that game in part because he lives in Albany and would be able to get home to his family Saturday evening. I'm disappointed that the good intentions of our Charlotte colleagues have been intentionally hijacked by someone with a political agenda. That would be you, and sincerely appreciate Robert's personal input and professionalism throughout this episode. Okay, so, Britt, I don't think I've read anything quite that dishonest in a long time, but it reminds me of my central problem with the story, which is how mean is it to this guy, Robert Lee, in the end? They're not protecting him. They exposed him to ridicule. They made him famous in the worst way, and they prevented him from calling a game because of his name. It's cruel.
Yeah, this isn't the type of attention you want on the national scene. Obviously, we know who he is now, but now these pictures, once the 24-hour news cycle goes away, he's going to be associated with Robert E. Lee, and they're superimposed together. I just think that this climate really is sending the wrong message, and Clay touched on it with Colin Kaepernick, whether it's him kneeling, Kevin Durant not wanting to go to the White House and people challenging that. If you dare speak up, and a lot of Americans are sick of being labeled a bigot, if they don't agree with whatever is on the left with some of these athletes and agendas. So hopefully the announcer can recover and we get past this cycle.
No, it's mass hysteria. We'll be embarrassed at this moment 20 years from now.
Let me respond
really quickly,
because John Skipper took a shot at me, the president of ESPN. I mean, look at this story. Everyone who came out said every reasonable person can see an Asian guy who's alive today and realize that it's not a dead Confederate general from 1870. This is the problem with ESPN and their leadership. They talk to us like we're a bunch of idiots and imbeciles and sell crap and expect us to see it and think, oh, my God, how lucky we are that ESPN is treating us this way. This is not true. This is a lie. I want you to think about this, just everybody out there watching right now. ESPN is the most powerful sports media company in the world, all right? If they come to an employee who might make $75,000 a year and rarely ever gets to call college football games, and they say, hey, we're a little bit concerned because you have the same name as Robert E. Lee in Charlottesville. Do you really believe the guy making $75,000 a year makes the decision about whether or not he's going to call the game? Or like every employee sitting out there right now, when your rich bosses sit you down and say, hey, we've got a little concern, how about you do this instead? He did what the company wanted him to do, and now they're throwing him under the bus, claiming that they were afraid a few people would make fun of him during the game. Well, instead, they created a national story that has now lasted for multiple days with his name completely connected to Robert E. Lee.
I agree. I'm sorry I'm laughing, but when an ESPN producer or executive calls you dumb, I mean, the irony alarm goes off. It's unbelievable. Clay, Britt, thank you very much. Good to see you both.
Appreciate it.